He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Cryptid Clues. We have a very special episode today focusing heavily on the UAP conference that took place on Capitol Hill Wednesday, July 26th, 2023, which we're recording this shortly after that, but it's being released a little bit later. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, just a little housekeeping. Earlier this month, we dropped a heckin' good story time with a comedic flair. It's a wonderfully AI-generated story that I kept prompting and recording live. I just kept losing it. It was great. We also have an interview episode with Taylor featuring Ryan Willis from Sasquatch University. And just last week, we dropped an episode focusing on Dogman encounters. That and more are all available on our social media channels. So without further ado, let's get into the meat of today's episode. Taylor.
Yes. Now, Reuben, we've talked aliens, UAPs, UFOs before. Just last month, I did an episode on the Las Vegas alien occurrences, and I briefly highlighted a Mr. David Grush and his statements on that episode. And so much has escalated and developed since then. During this conference that we will be deep diving into, he returned under oath as a witness, alongside two other very credible witnesses that were also under oath. And they basically presented their testimonies and did a full Q&A session with members of Congress. Now,
that's quite the escalation. It's quite the escalation. Going from the LA, like Las Vegas alien things and the aliens in the backyard and like, oh, you and I are inspecting these little clips and stuff, to just suddenly like U.S. Congress is like, hey guys, just so you know, here you go. Here's a bunch of stuff.
Absolutely.
That was wild.
Totally. Couldn't agree more. And this whole hearing that was conducted, I felt like it was super under the rug. I'm not even sure if you were aware of it until I brought your attention to it, because I wasn't aware of it until the night before someone brought it to my attention. And I felt like it was probably for intentional reasons kind of swept under the rug. Let's all talk about the Barbie movie box office ratings. Let's talk about a whole bunch of other stuff, but
Oppenheimer
and all, yeah, exactly. And maybe don't check out this hearing that's occurring on Capitol Hill on this day. But needless to say, we did.
I was playing D&D on Sunday, and I was just kind of talking about it. I was like, hey, what's your opinion on the Congress in the U.S. there with the alien topic? And they're like, what? Everyone pulls out their phones, and they're like, what are you talking about? And then if you Google it, half of the news articles also sweep it under the rug. And they're very, like, they talk about it very common, like, nothing much was really mentioned. It was just, they kind of talked about UFOs, and they took it a little bit too seriously. And it was like, no, they took it. They took it very seriously. There was literal reveals happening there. This is the U.S. Congress going, hey, you know what? Let's ask some questions and then be told, oh yeah, no, it's a thing. It's been happening for a while now.
Yeah, it's a game changer. It really, really is. I hope many people, if they haven't watched it, they go back and they tune into it, because there's a lot of good information from it. To me, it felt like watching that scene in like Independence Day or like a Marvel movie or something, where you see the senators all gathered talking about it. It's like, this is that moment.
It's funny too, because if you take the entire Congress and you dial it down to those moments, that's exactly what it is. But it's actually just stretched over a couple of hours, where it's the blank spaces are filled with, I can neither confirm or deny.
Yeah.
I can't talk about that in a public setting. Yes and no. And it's like, oh, what are you getting at? Like, this is the public hearing, and you keep censoring it, saying, yeah, we can't talk about that in a public setting, though. And then you get to something very specific, and it's like, oh, yeah, that's a thing. But which I'll get into those details a little bit later, but carry on, Taylor.
Well, the irony of saying I can't talk about that in a public setting, you might as well just say yes, because I mean, you look super guilty as charged as far as I'm concerned, especially when all three of your witnesses under oath so they say the same thing. I digress, though. So starting with David Grush, he served as an intelligence officer in the United States Air Force and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Lieutenant Ryan Graves, he was a former U.S. Navy pilot, F-18 pilot specifically, and then retired Navy Commander David Fravor, who has his own UAP experience, notably the Tic Tac event footage, which we did an episode on that. We're playing it on the feed here and watched the footage and dissected the video footage of that and everything. So he was tied to that, which is really, really fantastic that he was a key witness for this testimony. So as the conference unfolds, Congress wastes no time in shedding light on their personal beliefs on UAPs. I felt like everyone was really excited to get into such a unknown topic for the most part. And I was really, really happy with this because, political bias aside, you see a room full of Democrats and Republicans, and they were all united in this single front to learn the truth about what is really going on with UAPs and aliens. It was very powerful to see. And I believe the term nonpartisan was actually used to reflect that. And I just think there's so much that we can get done. I just felt, these are human beings just trying to get answers for more human beings. It felt genuine. So, moving ahead, they addressed a topic that, again, we covered earlier this year, Chinese weather balloon, if you want to call it that, and what they labeled as UAPs following the takedown of that initial balloon. The mention of how the American government did not properly disclose those events, thus displaying a lack of being forthright with the American people. The U.S. government spent over 1.5 million taxpayer dollars on missiles for this situation. I did not realize that they spent 1.5 million. That is a lot. But still, no clarity came forward on what was being dealt with. And I remember seeing the interviews with, I can't remember the military personnel's name, but the press was asking, does the public have a right to know what is above their heads? And the guy just said, well, the public has every right to look up and see for themselves. It was the most blandest response you could give. But I loved how the situation, I loved how this was the starting period, and I couldn't sympathize more that government superpower that withholds the truth and clarity of a very serious, unidentified threat across North American airspace is just kind of brought up into this conversation here at Capitol Hill. So it's good that the two are referenced with each other. Following this, though, unless you have anything you want to add.
I mean, just moving up from weather balloon, swamp gas stuff to aliens in the backyard to U.S. Congress going, hey, I can keep repeating this, but I want to save those details. So you carry on, Taylor. Let's get a little deeper into this. Okay. And then I can just do all the spoilerific comments I want to make. Okay.
So following this, the groundwork on how we can create a better system for civilians and officials to report unknown activity is being applied, which I hadn't really thought about. It's staggering, though, how little there is for industry workers, such as pilots and contractors, to actually report inexplainable occurrences. But it makes sense. Taking the mic first was Mr. Burchett, and I quote, "Since 1969, the position our military has kept is that UFOs pose no threat to national security and are not worthy of further study. I'd say that's the biggest understatement of the decade." End quote. Wow. Anything you want to chime in with there?
First of all, for the military, for all this stuff, for them just to say, hey, you know what? UFOs pose no threat. That's either A, denying the existence of UFOs, or B, stating that, well, we know exactly what they are, and we know for whatever reason or another that they're no threat at all. So there's some plausible deniability there, but I feel like they've known for a long, long time what's behind the UFO UAP phenomenon. And for some reason in particular, maybe some kind of rules or something like that, they feel very comfortable with their existence. You know? Like we've just had this reveal happen to us. as like a legit official thing. But to go back from that and be like, well, they already know way more than this. Like, there's so much out there we don't know yet. And clearly it's currently nothing to be scared of.
Currently, yeah. Emphasis on currently for sure. As the witnesses are sworn in under oath, they started with Mr. Graves, who presents himself and voices his support for over 30 other officers he knows personally that also have had UAP experiences. He describes how most sightings are not reported, are not rare, and are routine. Pilots witness UAPs everywhere, and the stigma that's attached to this is equally as real. Silencing of commercial pilots by fear of repercussions, discouraging witnesses and such. Branches of government are much more informed than they let on about UAPs, but specific security measures keep that information hidden. And I quote, in 2014, I was an F-18 Foxtrot pilot in the Navy Fighter Attack Squadron 11, the Red Rippers, and I was stationed at NAS Oceana in Virginia Beach. After upgrades were made to our jet's radar systems, we began detecting unknown objects operating in our airspace. At first, we assumed they were radar errors, but soon we began to correlate the radar track with multiple onboard sensors, including infrared systems, and eventually through visual ID. During a training mission 10 miles off the coast of Virginia Beach, 2 F-18 Super Hornets were split by a UAP. The object, described as a dark gray or black cube inside of a clear sphere, came within 50 feet of the aircraft and was estimated to be 5 and 15 feet in diameter. The mission commander terminated the flight immediately and returned to base. Our squadron submitted a safety report, but there was no official acknowledgement of the incident and no further mechanism to report these sightings. Soon, these encounters became so frequent that aircrew would discuss UAPs as part of their regular pre-flight briefs. End quote. Hot tamale.
Can you imagine you sign up for something like this? You become a pilot or whatever, and you're just like, oh, this is a normal part of your morning routine. These UAPs, UFOs. Hey, today, guys, like, this and that's probably going to happen. There's some stuff in the sky. Be on the lookout. That's it. Sip your morning coffee. Resume things as normal. It's kind of like us right now with the reveal. People in general with this whole reveal from Congress that everyone knows about is we're all so busy with our lives, paying bills, doing all this crazy stuff, that they drop UFOs and aliens and stuff on us with this, and they go, oh no, we don't want to tell the public because the public will freak out. And then they tell the public, and the public's like, okay, shrug. Just like these pilots.
Yeah, that's absolutely spot on, I would dare say. See a lot of that, people busy with their lives, actually, on the receiving end of everything that was going on with this conference. Anyways, I digress. So, Mr. Graves continues talking on about commercial pilots being the majority witnesses seeing these things. But again, no proper intake for them to disclose their sighting information. And we're talking about pilots with 20 to 30 years of aviation experience behind them. Notably, most of these sightings are reported to Mr. Graves at being above the commercial flights in low Earth orbit of 40,000 feet, making inexplainable movements such as sharp turns. A lot of these sightings are even reoccurring, particularly north of Hawaii and in the North Atlantic Ocean. And in closing, Mr. Graves reiterates that if these are foreign drones, national security is at stake, and if they are something else, it is a matter for science. But ultimately, we the people have a right to know what is flying above us in our skies, something I couldn't agree more with. I mean, if you board a plane, I want to know what all my risk factors are. They say it's the safest way to travel, but just watch out for unidentified flying objects. And it goes hand in hand with the military guy from before. We have a right to know. And he's just saying, well, just use your own eyes. Like, well, are my taxes not paying for the proper security and observation systems that you're working with?
Can you imagine they start turning these airline flights into like almost like you're in a Jeep going through a zoo or something? And to your left there, you'll see the reptilian starship. Just on board right now, they're actually abducting 3 individuals from our very plane. Please stay fastened to your seatbelts, and we'll keep moving on ahead.
Let's see. Commercially speaking, they'll probably charge extra for those seats. It's like not even a first class.
And if you roll down the window in first class right now, you can actually high five one of those reptilians for $5. They're asking for $5 for a high five.
There you go. That's exactly it. Oh, humanity. My goodness. So the hearing continues forwards to Mr. Grush, and he wastes no time getting into this. David Grush confirms that the reality for his whistleblowing position started due to learning that the U.S. government is operating with secrecy above congressional oversight with regards to UAPs, and then confirms his testimony is based on information he's been given by individuals with a long-standing track record of legitimacy and service to the United States. This information includes photography, classified documents, oral testimonies to Mr. Grush, and other high-ranking officials. And I quote, "I was informed in the course of my official duties of a multi-decade UAP crash retrieval and reverse engineering program to which I was denied access to those additional read-ons when I requested it." End quote. I was like, whoa. And I've heard that reverse engineering notion a few times in the past, but just to kind of get it in this setting. Now, you have to take it with a grain of salt, for sure. They're under oath. You have these three individuals that are very well credentialed reporting these things, but do we believe this? I mean, there'll definitely be some apprehension, and even myself, I'm a little apprehensive about it, but maybe that's just because it's shocking to hear this.
It is, and we're still in a setting now where people are going to deny this. They're going to say, "Oh, well, these whistleblowers, they have all these crazy credentials and they have all these witnesses." But if this is really them whistleblowing and saying something they're not supposed to, why aren't they being arrested and threatened? Like, obviously, if they're not being dealt with, this must be fake. That's going to be a standpoint that a lot of people are going to take on this. At the same time, let's flip that story on its head. To use your word, devil's advocate. Let's say that maybe this reveal isn't as real as it's supposed to be. Maybe these whistleblowers are being told to release this information this way.
So, in a sense, just to derail, to create a false narrative, like we don't really have a reverse engineering retrieval program or anything like that. It's something entirely different.
Or they're being told to reveal just these little pieces of it and make it sound a lot different than it really is. Like we're still being drip fed all of this stuff, but now we're being drip fed much larger drips, and they're selectively choosing what they're telling us to hide the real narrative behind it.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I've heard some very interesting things where things could go in the near future, and depending how they drip feed certain selective narratives, that might go hand in hand with that, depending how the future goes. I hope it's real, though, and I hope that it's not being manipulated with some sinister thought behind it.
Mm-hmm.
But lastly, we move to Commander Fravor. And as I mentioned before, the Tic Tac video back in 2004, he was the commanding officer of the Strike Fighter Squadron 41, the world-famous Black Aces.
Oh, one digit off of 42.
42.
The answer to everything. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Oh, yes. I have not seen that in a good minute. I need to rewatch that, actually.
You have to rewatch it at least 42 times.
Yeah.
You can't truly understand it otherwise.
No. And I quote, "On this day, we were scheduled for a 2v2 air training with the USS Princeton as our control. When we launched off next, my wingman was told that the training was being suspended and we were going to proceed with real-world tasking. As we proceed to the west, the air controller was counting down on the range to an object that we were going to. Unaware of what we were going to see when we arrived, the controller told us that these objects have been observed for over 2 weeks, coming down from over 80,000 feet, rapidly descending to 20,000 feet, hanging out for hours, and going straight back up. And for those who don't realize, 80,000 feet is space. We arrived at the location at approximately 20,000 feet, and the controller called merge plot, which means our radar blip is now in the same resolution cell as the contact. As we looked around, we noticed that I messed up my notes here. We noticed that we had whitewater off our right side. It's important to note the weather on this day was as close as perfect as you could ask for off the coast of San Diego. Clear skies, light winds, calm seas, no whitecaps or waves. So the whitewater stood out in a large blue ocean. All four of us, since we were in F-18s, so we had pilots with us in the back seats, looked down and saw a small tic-tac object with a longitude and axis pointing north-south and moving very abruptly over the water like a ping pong ball. There were no rotors, no rotor wash, or any sign of visible control surfaces like wings. As we started clockwise toward the object, we decided to go down and take a closer look at the other aircraft staying at high cover to observe both us and the tic-tac. We proceeded around a circle about 90 degrees and started our descent, and the object suddenly shifted its longitude axis, aligned it with my aircraft, and began to climb. We continued down another 270 degrees nose low, where the tic-tac would have been. Our altitude at this point is around 15,000 feet, and the tic-tac was about 12,000. As we pulled nose onto the object, within about half a mile of it, it rapidly accelerated in front of us and disappeared. Our wingman, roughly 8,000 feet above us, lost contact also. So we start to turn back towards the east. The controller came back and said, "Sir, you're not going to believe this, but that thing is on your cap. Point roughly 60 miles away in less than a minute. You can calculate the speed." We returned, taking off our gear and talking to one of my crews that were getting ready to launch. We mentioned it to them, and they went out and luckily got the video that you see that's 90 seconds. What you don't see is the radar tape that was never released and don't know where it's at, or the active jamming that the object put on our radar. What is shocking to us is that the incident was never investigated, none of my crew ever questioned, and tapes were never taken, and after a couple days, it turned into a great story with friends. It wasn't until 2009 until Jay Stratton, the United States government UFO hunter, works for the Office of Naval Intelligence, had contacted me to investigate, unbeknownst at all, that he was part of the ATI program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. End quote. That was a lot. And this was very, very interesting to get the backstory of that tic-tac footage.
I should have had a little thing of Tic Tacs to eat while you were talking about this.
How's that commercial go? It's not just a min. It's a Tic Tac.
Whoa, what is that? Is that a UFO? It's not just a UFO. That's a Tic Tac.
Yeah, there you go.
How it feels to chew 5 gum.
Oh, I love those commercials. So, how do you feel about this, Reuben?
I mean, I felt the same.
The same
as I did when we talked about it before. It is what it is.
Fair.
And this backstory to it is interesting. I like the information. It's still about the same thing. It's cool. It's really all it is. Mm-hmm. I'm glad that it's posted here now, you know? It's evidence.
Absolutely. Is at this point, after posting that Commander Fravor mentions how with his crew members during the encounter have also been reached out to, and that several things had started to shift in a direction where the stigma and transparency had to be addressed surrounding UAPs. It's becoming much more of an open concept. So in closing, and I quote, "The Tic Tac object we engaged in 2004 was far superior to anything we had on time, have today, or looking to develop in the next 10 years. Mm-hmm. End quote. That was a very powerful statement. I felt like, ooh, Independence Day. After that, Chairman Mr. Grothman then takes the lead in asking the questions to the 3 witnesses. And again, we're going to continue that off into a part 2. But I wanted just to focus on the testimonies for this first part because it was a very interesting introduction. Mm-hmm. But in our closing, not Commander Fravor's closing anymore, but in our closing, I guess, where it kind of like steers down into the conference, you mentioned many a time they say, oh, we can't answer that in a public setting, but we're open to revealing that in a private setting after this hearing. And yeah. They mentioned a few other things, but yeah, take it away.
I want to save a lot for part 2 as well. I do kind of want to drop just a couple quick, maybe not questions, but just comments that maybe you can comment on. How did you feel after these testimonies when they're talking about certain things and Congress is like, well, were any of these ships ever recovered? Were any of these things ever done? And the guy at the stand, he was like, well, yes. And we also recovered non-human biologics.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that to me was like the trophy moment of the whole thing, where it was like, well, okay, why won't you just call them aliens? And I'm going to save my thoughts on that for that part too. I'm going to save some of the stuff that I've dived into where they've dissected this and gone, well, if you look at how he says it here and they say, well, where are these things from? The way the answer's formed really gives you an answer to that question that he didn't directly say yes or no to, but he did answer quite a few questions later on. There's some stuff I want to uncover with that. But Taylor, how did you feel about, after all this, immediately going into those questions?
Where I'm at in my life, I have reached a point where people in certain power or positions of power, notably political positions of power, are very selective on the words they use. And those words are very key. It's almost like a binding contract where contracts use very specific terminology and you have to read the fine print because it can be misleading sometimes. You could overlook something. And I feel like in the hearing and the things that these individuals were answering to the questions, I feel like it, again, very specific terminology. It's funny that you mentioned the aliens over non-human biologics and that sort of thing. And I'm looking forward to talking about that with you in our part 2 of this. But for me, that was a significant highlight. The only time that I feel like I could ever really, I guess, get on board with them finding bodies is the Roswell incident. But again, that's just, who knows what really went on there with the Roswell situation. And you hear things here and there, but just to have it mentioned in an open setting like this totally blew my mind. Mm-hmm. The fact that, and we will talk more about this in part 2, that there were incidences where human beings were harmed in not only reverse engineering, but in events dealing with these non-human biologicals and whatever technology they're employing. That's incredibly scary to know. And
Yep.
I want to explore that more. I want
Absolutely.
to know more.
We're going to dissect it all in part 2, and I'm probably going to be referring to a lot of different theories. We're going to be looking at, well, are they aliens? Is this actually legit? Is there something deeper they're hiding from us? Is this a lead up to Project Bluebeam? And then, of course, dive into the usual that I go into. Well, is it really demons or something like that? We're going to look at everything. And, of course, we'll get Taylor's opinion on everything that I say as usual as well, so we can really get both sides of the story. I believe that's all that we have for today's episode. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, Taylor?
I mean, lastly, I mean, ultimately, like I mentioned before, this hearing having taken place is huge. Several Congress members that advocated for Mr. Burchett confided in him that they too have experienced UAP encounters of their own. You have representatives from other countries that attended this hearing. And this set the stage for an incredible new light to be shed on this topic. And it's, like you said, it's so much deeper than we realize. Felt like it was a scene out of a movie. Mm-hmm. And this being recorded and openly discussed, future generations are going to possibly look back and see this. Maybe this will be put in the school curriculum and think, hey, what if this is that turning point when they can finally see, like, this is when things really start to transition over. We got the proof that we needed that these beings finally land on our backyard.
This was part 1 of the trilogy leading to the end of the world.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Yeah. But other than that, that is all I got. So again, thank you for tuning in to this episode. You can find us on our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. Patreon, ad-free early episodes available there. And if you want to reach out, send us an email, CryptidClues@gmail.com. But until next time.
Bye-bye.